Look at a map of Russia. It is a landmass so vast it swallows 11 time zones. In the late 19th century, this colossal empire faced a terrifying problem. It was paralyzed by its own size. The Tsar in St. Petersburg ruled over 22 million square kilometers of land, but he couldn't reach half of it. The eastern edge of the empire, the Pacific coast, was thousands of kilometers away, undefended, and totally isolated. To fix this, Russia decided to build the impossible, a single ribbon of steel stretching 9,289 kilometers across the most hostile terrain on the planet. This is the story of the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was meant to be the project that saved the Russian autocracy. Instead, it became a corridor of corruption, war, and death that led directly to the collapse of the empire itself. This story is 7 chapters long, split into 14 detailed parts, and we hope you love it. Chapter 1. To understand why Russia built this railway, you have to understand the sheer, suffocating isolation of Siberia in the 1880s. Russia considered itself a Pacific power, claiming the port of Vladivostok, ruler of the East. But in reality, Vladivostok might as well have been on the moon. If a Russian official in St. Petersburg wanted to send a message or a regiment of soldiers to Vladivostok, they had 2 terrible options. 1. The sea route. They could load ships in the Baltic, sail all the way around Africa or South America, across the Indian Ocean, and up the Asian coast. This journey took 6 to 8 months and relied on the goodwill of the British Empire, Russia's rival, to refuel at coal ports too. The land route, they could attempt to cross Siberia by horse and cart. This was a journey of pure misery. The Great Siberian Tract was barely a road. It was a muddy scar cut through the forest. In spring and autumn, the rains turned the track into a swamp so deep it could swallow a carriage whole. In winter, the temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, freezing travelers to death in their saddles. This journey took over a year. This disconnection was a geopolitical nightmare. The symbol of the Russian Empire was the two-headed eagle, looking both west to Europe and east to Asia. But the eagle's eastern head was blind and paralyzed. The danger was real. To the south, the sleeping giant of China was being carved up by European powers. To the east, a newly modernized and aggressive Japan was rising rapidly. The Russian generals looked at their maps and realized a terrifying truth. If Japan or Britain decided to seize Russia as Pacific territories, the Tsar would be helpless to stop them. He simply couldn't move his army to the fight. The vastness of Siberia, once Russia's greatest defense against invasion, had become its greatest weakness. The pressure on Tsar Alexander III was immense. He needed a way to stitch the bleeding edges of his empire together, and he needed it immediately. The answer was a railway. But this wasn't just an infrastructure project, it was an act of desperate survival. The Tsar was about to order his engineers to conquer a wilderness that had defeated every army in history, and he was about to do it with a treasury that was effectively empty. The decision to build the Trans-Siberian Railway was formalized in 1891, and it came directly from the autocratic will of Tsar Alexander III. He saw the railway as a destiny, an almost religious mission to finally unite the Russian lands. His most crucial appointment to oversee the project was Sergei Vita, a brilliant but ruthless minister of finance who had previously proven his capability in managing Russia as state-owned railways. Vita was the architect of the project's financing. The cost was astronomical, estimated at 350 million gold rubles, an utterly staggering sum that the Russian treasury simply did not possess. Vita's plan relied on massive foreign loans, mainly from France, betting that the eventual revenue from Siberian exports and settler migration would pay the debt. He viewed the project purely as an economic engine, intended to industrialize the East. The construction began in May 1891, with immense symbolic fanfare in Vladivostok. The Tsar deliberately sent his son, the young Tsarevich, Nicholas, the future Nicholas II, to strike the first symbolic spadeful of dirt. This act was crucial. It officially designated the railway as a royal project, binding the destiny of the Romanoff dynasty to the destiny of the track. However, from the very start, the project was plagued by a fundamental internal conflict that would cripple its efficiency. The eternal Russian tension between ambition and reality. While Vita insisted on sound construction and economic viability, the military generals, driven by the urgency of the Japanese threat, demanded speed above all else. This clash led to a fateful compromise. The railway would be built as quickly and cheaply as possible. It was to be a single-track line, often laid with lighter rails and built with minimal infrastructure, a solution designed to rapidly move troops, not sustain long-term economic prosperity. The task ahead was monumental. The engineers had to plan a route over 9,000 kilometers long with no existing maps, no roads, and no labor force. They faced an engineering challenge that dwarfed the American Transcontinental Railroad. To even begin, they had to confront the true enemy of the Russian dream, the Siberian Wilderness itself, with its impassable swamps, raging rivers, and the ever-present terrifying mystery of the permafrost. Chapter 2. As the construction began simultaneously from both the eastern and western ends of the line, the engineers immediately understood why this challenge was called impossible. They weren't just building a railroad. They were battling the core geology and biology of the Siberian interior. The very environment of the Taiga, the immense, swampy boreal forest, was actively hostile to permanent human structures. The workers' first enemy was the forest itself. The taiga was so thick and dense that every single kilometer of the route had to be laboriously cleared by hand, using axes and fire. There were no paths, no infrastructure, and no way to easily transport supplies. Everything had to be dragged or floated thousands of kilometers. The second, far more insidious enemy was the ground. The route ran straight across vast stretches of permafrost ground that is permanently frozen hundreds of feet deep. While the surface seemed solid and stable during the long, brutal winter, the moment the top layer thawed in the brief wet Siberian summer, it turned into a massive, unpredictable quagmire. Imagine the construction site. The ground, which had been frozen solid like concrete, would suddenly soften into a deceptive, oozing swamp that could swallow a horse. This was disastrous for laying track. If the track was laid on the surface during the winter, the summer thaw would cause the ground underneath to shift, buckle, and sometimes even liquefy, making the newly laid rail line twist into impossible shapes and rendering it useless. The engineering teams had to devise complex, expensive solutions to stabilize the track, often sinking massive wooden piles deep into the ground, only to find that the rotting wood was undermined by the endless cycle of freezing and thawing. This environmental instability meant that the Trans-Siberian Railway was never truly finished in the Western sense. It was a permanent, ongoing struggle against the earth itself, constantly sinking, shifting, and demanding relentless backbreaking maintenance. The physical effort was immense, but the human cost of this endless battle against the elements would define the project's tragic legacy. The immense scale of the Trans-Siberian Railway required a labor force unlike any seen before. Since Siberia was largely unpopulated, the Russian state relied on a desperate mix of labor: soldiers, local peasants, Chinese and Korean contract workers, and, crucially, thousands of convicts and political exiles from the Tsarist penal system. The conditions these men endured were horrific. They lived in crude, makeshift barracks built from logs, offering minimal protection against the elements. The Siberian winter was the chief executioner. Temperatures routinely dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, making work outside a daily struggle against frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. The cold was so intense that equipment often froze solid, and men had to use fire just to thaw the tracks before working. Disease was also rampant. Scurvy, due to the lack of fresh food over long winters, and typhus, spread by lice in the cramped, unsanitary barracks, swept through the camps, killing hundreds at a time. The official death tolls were notoriously underreported, but historians estimate that thousands of laborers perished from accidents, disease, and exposure. The labor was so brutal that at certain peak periods, the fatality rate among the convict and exile work gangs was as high as 10% per year. The use of convict labor, while cheap for the state, led to shoddy construction. These men, driven by guards and desperate to survive, focused on laying track fast rather than laying it well. This was exacerbated by the lack of supervision and the overwhelming distances. Supplies of steel, rails, tools, and food often arrived late or spoiled, further eroding the quality of the work and the health of the workers. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway was, in essence, a brutal humanitarian disaster justified by strategic necessity. The line was forged not only from steel and wood, but from the frozen bodies and broken wills of the men who laid it. Despite the immense suffering, by 1898, the line had reached the massive, unmoving obstacle that no human effort could simply dig through: Lake Baikal. This colossal geographic barrier would force the Russian state into a final, ridiculous, and ultimately fatal compromise. Chapter 3. By 1898, the railway had succeeded in spanning thousands of kilometers of swamp and forest. But the construction teams had hit the largest and most immovable obstacle in their path: Lake Baikal. Baikal is not just a lake. It is a geographic anomaly. It is the largest and deepest freshwater lake in the world, holding more water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. Its depth is immense, making a conventional bridge or underwater tunnel an engineering impossibility for the time. Furthermore, Baikal is notorious for its fierce, unpredictable storms that can whip the water into a violent, ship-swallowing frenzy in a matter of minutes. In the winter, the entire lake freezes to a depth of over a meter. The logical engineering solution was to build the Circumbaikal Railway, a difficult, slow route winding hundreds of kilometers around the southern cliffs and unstable mountains of the lake. However, the military, led by the Tsarist government, refused. They insisted that the strategic urgency, the need to link the two halves of the railway, immediately before a war broke out, could not wait for the 5 years it would take to build the Circumbaikal line. The compromise was ludicrous. The Trans-Siberian Railway would end on one shore of the lake and restart on the other. For the immediate future, all trains, cargo, and passengers would be carried across the massive body of water. To achieve this, Russia purchased 2 massive, specialized ferry ships from an English shipyard. including a powerful icebreaker named the Baikal. In a feat of logistical absurdity, these massive steel vessels were completely disassembled, shipped across the entire length of the Trans-Siberian track to the edge of the lake, and then painstakingly riveted back together on the shore. This temporary solution allowed the railway to officially declare itself complete in 1901, though the 80-kilometer gap across the water was a massive, dangerous and unreliable bottleneck that was about to become the single most crippling factor in a war Russia could no longer avoid. While the massive imported ferries the Baikal and the Angara were engineering marvels, the ferry system was a commercial and logistical nightmare. Even on calm days, the process of shunting the enormous trains onto the ships, securing them, and making the 3-hour crossing was slow and cumbersome, resulting in massive delays for cargo. But the real threat was the lake itself. Baikal's storms were utterly unpredictable. A beautiful morning could instantly turn into a violent gale that made the crossing impossible for days, stranding trains and thousands of passengers on either shore. Moreover, the thick winter ice often overwhelmed the capacity of the flagship icebreaker, the Baikal, slowing the pace to a crawl and forcing the engineers to admit that their complete railway was only operational at the mercy of the weather. Minister Sergei Vida, despite his desire for a cheap, fast solution, understood the fatal flaw of the gap. Even as the ferries began operating, Vida quietly poured funds into continuing the construction of the permanent, Circumbaikal railway line. This route was the engineering true nightmare, requiring the cutting of over 39 tunnels through the unstable granite cliffs and building hundreds of bridges and retaining walls along the treacherous southern shore. It was the most expensive stretch of the entire railway, but Vida knew it was the only way to secure the line permanently. However, the Circumbaikal line was still years from completion. Imagine being a soldier or a migrant arriving at the edge of the lake in 1903. You have already traveled across 5,000 kilometers of rough, jostling track, only to stand on the edge of a massive, frozen expanse. You must disembark your train, wait hours for the temperamental ice ferry to dock, and then cross a dangerous, windswept lake before boarding a second train on the other side. This bottleneck was a physical manifestation of the compromise that Tsar had made, a railway built on haste and hope. The entire strategic utility of the line, the speed at which Russia could mobilize its forces to the east, was dependent on the unreliable crossing. And as the political storm clouds gathered over the Pacific, the military would soon demand the impossible from the rickety single-track line. Chapter 4. The strategic need for the Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't abstract. It was driven by the fear of a geopolitical collision that Russia itself helped accelerate. The flashpoint was Manchuria, the vast resource-rich region of northeast China. Russia, still convinced of its own imperial superiority, viewed the territory as a key strategic prize. Their solution to the slow northern sweep of the Trans-Siberian line was a massive, aggressive shortcut. The Chinese Eastern Railway CIR, this subsidiary line cut directly across Manchuria to the Russian-leased port of Port Arthur on the Yellow Sea, and also branched to Vladivostok by building the CER. Russia drastically reduced the length of the Trans-Siberian journey, but it fatally extended its own military reach deep into Asian territory and onto a direct collision course with a rising power, Japan. Japan, following its rapid Meiji restoration, had transformed itself from a feudal state into a modern industrial and military power in just 3 decades. The Japanese leadership viewed the massive, permanent Russian military presence in Manchuria and their increasing influence over Korea as a direct, existential threat to their security. For Japan, the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway was not just a symbol of Russian expansion. It was a physical invasion of their sphere of influence. Despite urgent warnings from diplomats that Japan was prepared to fight over Manchuria and Korea, the Tsarist court remained arrogant and dismissive, characterizing the Japanese as an inferior, non-European enemy. They believed Russia could simply occupy the territories and dare Japan to respond. Tsar Nicholas II, who had struck the first rail in Vladivostok, shared this arrogant belief in Russia's military invincibility. By 1903, Japan had concluded that negotiations were pointless. The window of opportunity to strike before the Trans-Siberian was fully operational was closing fast. They saw the half-finished railway, with its single track and massive ferry gap at Baikal, not as an engineering marvel, but as an enormous vulnerability, a target ready to be exploited. The race for the Far East was over, and the war that would expose every flaw in the Tsar's great railway was about to begin. The war that Russia had desperately tried to forestall, with its hasty railway construction, finally erupted in the early hours of February 9, 1904. Without a formal declaration of war, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a surprise torpedo boat attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. This successful sneak attack immediately crippled a significant portion of Russia's naval power in the Far East. This act of war instantly shifted the entire strategic focus of the Russian Empire to the single-track ribbon of steel stretching across Siberia. The military's greatest fear that they would have to fight a massive land war thousands of kilometers from their supply bases was now a reality. The Russian generals, still holding on to their belief in ultimate victory, planned to win the war by using the Trans-Siberian Railway to transport over 400,000 troops and all their supplies eastward. The problem, however, was immediately apparent. The railway, built for speed and cheapness, was a bottleneck of epic proportions. The single-track line was never designed for the military volume now required. Every eastward-bound supply train had to wait in sidings for westward trains to pass, resulting in massive delays. Troops destined for the front found themselves stranded for weeks in remote Siberian stations, often running low on food and supplies before they even reached Lake Baikal. The most catastrophic bottleneck, however, was the Baikal Gap. At the very moment Russia needed smooth, rapid movement, every soldier and every ton of ammunition had to be offloaded, ferried across the treacherous lake, and then reloaded onto another train. When the lake froze, the situation became worse. Engineers had to lay temporary track directly across the ice, a dangerous and unreliable process that only allowed a crawl. The sheer logistical paralysis meant that by the time Russia managed to mobilize and deploy forces large enough to engage the Japanese seriously, the enemy had already gained critical ground and fortified key positions. The long, winding, single-track railway, once seen as the spine of the empire, became the fatal artery that bled the Russian war effort dry. Chapter 5. The outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in February 1904 turned the Trans-Siberian project from a slow, bureaucratic effort into a frantic, desperate race against time. Tsar Nicholas II demanded the impossible. The railway had to immediately increase its capacity, and the Circumbaikal line had to be finished at any cost to bypass the disastrous ferry gap. This sudden, massive wartime expenditure placed an intolerable strain on the Russian imperial treasury. Minister Sergei Vito was forced to return to European creditors, primarily the French, securing massive emergency loans. The final cost of the railway would eventually soar to well over 1.5 billion gold rubles, a sum that bankrupted the Tsarist government and permanently destabilized the Russian economy. The speed and urgency of the wartime construction created a perfect storm for corruption and inefficiency. With no time for proper oversight and billions of rubles flowing into remote Siberian locations, officials, contractors, and military officers engaged in spectacular fraud. Stories of blatant corruption became legendary. Officials would approve contracts for steel rails that were never delivered, pocketing the difference. Low quality, lightweight rails meant for local industry were substituted for the required heavy military-grade steel, making the already rough track even more unstable. Wooden bridges were built with rotten lumber, only to collapse months later. Shovels and axes purchased by the state were sold back to the state at inflated prices. This corruption was more than just theft. It was a direct sabotage of the war effort. Every ruble stolen meant weaker tracks, fewer supplies, and longer delays for the soldiers fighting in Manchuria. The moral decay of the Tsarist bureaucracy was laid bare. While Russian peasants and convicts were freezing and dying to lay the track, the very officials responsible for overseeing the work were growing rich, profiting from the defeat of their own nation. The railway was not just failing to save the Tsar's empire, it was actively destroying the public's faith in the entire system. Under immense pressure from the collapsing war effort, the engineers worked around the clock on the most complex segment of the entire route, the Circumbaikal Railway, cutting through the treacherous granite cliffs and unstable shoreline of the lake. This 260-kilometer stretch was an engineering miracle, built with desperation and high casualty rates. Finally, in September 1904, the Circumbaikal line was officially opened. The final piece of steel was laid, and the Trans-Siberian Railway, the single longest railway in the world, was technically complete. The crippling, dangerous ferry gap across Lake Baikal was finally closed. However, the completion was a case of too little, too late. The fundamental flaw of the entire project, the insistence on building a single-track line immediately, doomed the war effort. While the single track was enough to move civilian traffic, it was completely overwhelmed by the constant bidirectional demands of a massive military campaign. For a full-scale war, the railway needed to move at least 24 military trains per day to adequately supply the front. But the realities of the single track, combined with the thousands of miles of rough, poorly built sections from the rush construction, limited the actual traffic flow to barely 3 to 5 trains per day. The military machine was constantly starved. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and reinforcements were stuck in logistical gridlock thousands of kilometers away. The Japanese, with their secure, short supply lines across the sea, were able to concentrate superior force and logistics where and when they chose. The Tsarist government had spent a fortune and sacrificed thousands of lives to build the railway. Yet when tested in war, the line failed to deliver the strategic advantage it was designed for. The military failure in the Far East, culminating in the disastrous naval defeat in 1905, was therefore not a failure of courage, but a failure of logistics and infrastructure. The entire world watched as the Russian giant was defeated by a smaller, faster enemy that understood the critical importance of a sound, resilient supply chain. Chapter 6. The devastating military defeats suffered by Russia at the hands of Japan in 1905 were a national humiliation. But the true fatal consequence for the Romanov dynasty lay in the very railway they had rushed to build. The defeat was not just a loss of territory, it was a total collapse of public faith in the Tsar and the competence of the Tsarist bureaucracy. For years, the Tsar and his ministers had promised that the Trans-Siberian Railway would make Russia invincible in Asia. Instead, the railway delivered a humiliating defeat by failing to supply the army. The massive financial cost of the railway and the war paid for by burdensome French loans was suddenly seen by the people not as an investment in empire, but as a colossal, corrupt drain that had produced nothing but failure. The railway's role, however, did not end with the war. It became the literal conduit through which revolution traveled. The demoralized, defeated, and often revolutionary-minded soldiers who had been fighting in Manchuria were now loaded onto trains for the long, slow 1,000-mile journey back home to Western Russia. These men were angry. They had endured impossible conditions, shoddy equipment, and a war lost not by their own efforts, but by the incompetence of their generals and the corruption of the supply chain. As the trains crawled westward along the single-track line, the soldiers brought their fury, their anti-Tsarist sentiment, and their calls for radical political change directly into the heart of the empire. They stopped at every major station, spreading news of the military's ineptitude and the widespread corruption they had witnessed firsthand. The railway, intended to be the backbone of imperial control, became the artery of discontent. When these hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers finally reached the major population centers, they fueled the already simmering discontent among factory workers and peasants who were suffering from high taxes and food shortages. The military failure in the Far East, brought home by the railway, immediately sparked the massive civil unrest known as the 1905 Revolution. The Tsar's attempt to secure his empire in the East had directly resulted in his empire threatening to collapse from within. The discontent carried westward by the railway quickly escalated beyond mere protest. The disastrous military defeat in 1905, combined with events like the infamous Bloody Sunday Massacre, ignited a nationwide wave of strikes, mutinies, and peasant uprisings. The 1905 revolution shook the foundations of the Tsarist state and forced Nicholas II to make massive political concessions. The Trans-Siberian Railway played a dual and critical role during this period of civil war. Firstly, it was a target of the revolutionaries. Recognizing the railway as the military and economic spine of the empire, revolutionaries across Siberia and European Russia deliberately sabotaged sections of the track and attacked stations to paralyze the state's ability to respond. This was the ultimate irony. The structure built to guarantee Tsarist control was now being used as a weapon against it. Secondly, and paradoxically, the railway also became the key to the Tsar's survival. The single-track line, though inadequate for a massive foreign war, was just effective enough to move loyal troops from various parts of the empire back to the major cities. By using the Trans-Siberian to rush relatively intact regiments back from the periphery, the government was able to crush the most violent uprisings and restore a fragile, temporary order. The revolution ultimately forced the Tsar to issue the October Manifesto, which promised civil liberties and created a legislative body, the Duma. However, the damage was done. The Trans-Siberian Railway, meant to extend the glory of the Romanoffs, had instead exposed their vulnerability, demonstrated their incompetence to the world, and provided the physical and emotional vehicle that delivered the seeds of revolution to their doorstep. The railway survived the initial crisis, but the empire it was meant to save did not. The line would spend the next decade struggling to improve its capacity and stabilize its shoddy wartime construction, only to face an even greater conflict end, a final terminal revolution that would fulfill the railway's tragic destiny as the engine of collapse. Chapter 7 The Trans-Siberian Railway's tragic fate was sealed not by the limited war against Japan, but by the overwhelming demands of World War I 1914 to 1917. After the 1905 revolution, Russia had attempted to double-track key segments of the line and improve its stability. But these efforts were partial and slow. When the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary broke out, the single track running across Siberia became Russia's single most important, yet utterly vulnerable, lifeline. As the Baltic and Black Seas were blocked by enemy navies, Russia relied entirely on two ports for critical Western supplies: Murmansk in the Arctic and Vladivostok in the Pacific. The vast majority of war material, everything from guns and ammunition to medical supplies and locomotives, arrived in Vladivostok from the United States and Allied powers. The sheer volume of this cargo, known as the Siberian Express, was astronomical. The railway was forced to haul supplies thousands of miles from the Pacific coast all the way to the fighting front in Eastern Europe. The strain was catastrophic. The railway was driven 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, pushing the cheap, shoddy track and the outdated steam locomotives far beyond their capacity. Maintenance became impossible. The single track, still the dominant feature of the line, proved disastrous. With bottlenecks and breakdowns becoming constant, thousands of tons of vital supplies piled up in massive, chaotic mountains on the docks of Vladivostok, often sitting there for over a year because the railway simply could not move the goods westward fast enough. This logistical breakdown on the home front directly translated into catastrophic failure on the fighting front. The constant shortages of shells, food, and supplies destroyed the morale of the Russian army and fueled widespread starvation in the cities. The railway, which had delivered the shame of 1905, was now delivering the final conditions necessary for the destruction of the Romanoff dynasty in the 1917 revolution. The final, decisive role of the Trans-Siberian Railway was played during the February and October revolutions of 1917. The logistical collapse, caused by the war where trains carrying food to the cities were constantly delayed in favor of trains carrying ammunition, created the urban starvation that ultimately fueled the overthrow of the Tsar. When the major urban centers like Petrograd erupted into violence, the Tsarist regime was unable to use the railway to rush loyal troops to the capital in time, sealing the fate of the dynasty. After the Bolsheviks seized power in October, the railway became the most vital strategic asset in the brutal Russian Civil War. The Trans-Siberian was fought over constantly by the Bolshevik Red Army, the anti-Bolshevik White Army, and various foreign interventionist forces, including Czech legionaries who famously seized huge sections of the line. Whoever controlled the railway controlled the movement of armies, resources, and communication, and therefore controlled Russia. The single ribbon of steel, forged in the autocracy of Alexander III, became the path that determined the ultimate victory of the communist state. The Trans-Siberian Railway remains, even today, the longest single rail line in the world and an essential economic link. Yet its true legacy is historical irony. 1. A financial ruin. It was an immensely costly project that bankrupted the Tsarist regime, relying on vast foreign debt that destabilized the economy. 2. A geopolitical failure, built to guarantee Russia's military power in Asia. Its single-track design and logistical fragility guaranteed Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. The engine of revolution, intended to unify the empire under the Tsar, it instead acted as the perfect vector for transporting thousands of radicalized defeated soldiers back into the heartland, directly contributing to the revolutions that ended the Romanov dynasty forever. The railway was a monument to ambition and engineering willpower, but it stands as the ultimate example of how political hubris, economic corruption, and a fatal prioritization of speed over structural soundness can undermine even the most colossal undertaking. Russia finally conquered the Taiga and the permafrost, but in doing so, it unleashed the forces that led to its own undoing.